I'm nervous. I am. I even took my shoes off. When I was preparing the sermon, and thankful to Father Chase for inviting me to come here and preach, I began to realize for so many years that when I came up here, it was a very nice experience and I enjoyed it, and hopefully some of you enjoyed it as well. But having been away for a while, I also began to realize how holy this particular space is and how sacred it is. So I felt the need to take off my shoes. And it feels really good to be here, really good. When I was in the seminary, a little over 47 years ago, we had a teacher who taught us homiletics. We call them sermons, but called homilies then. And he told us a story that I have heard, I don't know how many times since, and how many times I've even used it in my own sermons. And I'm going to use it again right now, because I think it touches what we just heard as Gail read the gospel. There's an old story about a man who thought he had the future licked. He knew exactly what was going to happen. And by some magic, some chicanery, he managed to purchase a copy of the New York Times. And it was dated a year in advance. And so he looked through it, and he now knew what stocks to buy and which stocks to sell. He knew how much money he could make. He knew which properties were the best to buy in New York City. And so he was thrilled out of his mind. He knew exactly what was going to happen. And then he turned the page, and he discovered his name in the obituary column of that day. And in a split second, everything changed. The knowledge of his death changed this man's view, not only about his wealth, but about his life. And essentially, that's what Jesus is really trying to get us to understand in the scriptures today. It's not only a question of our wealth, it's really a question of our life, and which is more important. When I was learning how to preach, and our professor told us that we would be preaching to a rather varied audience, there would be people who would be really listening and hearing what you have to say. And then there would be people who would lose the attention of the moment, and you can usually tell them because their heads nod, and you try to know who you have to address your words to. I have a feeling Father Chase has run into that experience somewhere along the line himself. I know I have, but in any event, it's not because you disagree, it's just because we can't hold attention sometimes. And that was the guy in the story. There he was, with all the people that Jesus was preaching, and he's telling them what they need to do to be good people, what they need to do to be supportive people, loving and caring people. But this guy's obsession with his property is getting in the way, and he really can't hear anything. So instead of actually asking something about what Jesus is saying, he interrupts him and he says, "But teacher, please tell me, how am I going to work out this thing with my brother and the inheritance? Tell him to give me the money. You know, I like what you're saying, it's all very nice, but yada, yada, yada. I want my money." Well, reminds me when I was a teacher, that was even longer than 47 years ago, and I taught English to children, 6th graders. And I loved teaching, well, they call it language arts now, but it was English then. And I was teaching them about subjects and verbs, how a subject has to agree with the verb. And I thought they were listening, and then a hand went up, and it was a young boy, and I said, "Yes," and he said, "Mr. Pivinski," and I thought he was going to ask me a question about what I was saying. "Can I go to the bathroom?" Well, of course, he went to the bathroom, but that kid, like the guy in the story, were both consumed with something that was their own personal agenda. The little boy had to go to the bathroom, and the guy in the story wanted his money. So, what does that say to us today in our own lives? Well, when Jesus says to the man, well, I'm not your arbiter, I'm not your judge, why are you asking me that? He immediately turns right back around to his people and he says, watch out, beware for any sign of greed. Because at that point, Jesus recognizes that it's not so much the money this guy has, there's something going on in his heart. His heart is getting stony. His heart is not beating the way it should be, because all he can think about is himself. So, what is greed anyway? I think simply greed is wanting more than we need, never having enough. Greed is not really about how much we have, because you can be rich and greedy, you can be poor and greedy, and you can be middle class and greedy. I often fall into that latter trap, especially when I go shopping, either Wegmans or ShopRite. I am a sucker for sales. And invariably, I will buy more than one item that's on sale, very often 2 or 3, because, well, first of all, it's on sale, so I'm saving money. And second of all, well, you know, they may raise the price the next time I come here. And so I justify that to myself by saying, okay, Tom, you know, you're never gonna know when you need it again, so you better buy it. And I keep telling myself, well, yada, yada, yada. And of course, I fall into the trap and I buy it. Well, that's my sort of confession. Now, let me ask you to be a part of my confession. Not solely because I don't want to feel so alone here admitting that, but maybe you might be able to recognize something in your own self that sort of ties in with what we're talking about as to whether we think about ourselves only or do we think about others. Just reflect as I ask you a couple of questions. Do you have an education? Can you read? There are over 2 billion people in the world who cannot read. Do you have food in your refrigerator? Clothes on your back? A roof over your head? Someplace to sleep? We are richer than 75% of the people in the world. This one's a kicker. Do you have money in the bank? Do you have any in your wallet right now? How about some spare change lying in a dish? I do. Well, we are among the top 8% of the world's wealthy. Isn't it amazing? We would never think that, but to know that right here, we, the poorest of us, are still richer than most of the rest of the world. And don't we still find ourselves saying, oh, I want more. I want a little bit more. Now, we get fed that by television and radio and all those kind of things. And we fall for it. And it blocks out that whole story that Jesus is saying, if you're going to lay up treasures, lay them up for God as well. You know, he's not against this man who has the wealth. In fact, I think he probably was impressed with him because the guy worked hard. He probably earned his money rather honestly, but he let something out of the scenario. He left the fact that what he had was only for him. And often that's not something that we think about, But very often it's some way that we think. It's about me. It's about I. You hear the guy in the story. He says, well, what about my inheritance? Well, I will tear down my barns. I will build new barns. I will get bigger crops. And Jesus is saying, he's a wise man. But there's one thing that's wrong there. The guy has no recognition that what he has is not his alone. His was given to him by the grace and the goodness of God. All of us. The shirts on our back, the food on our table, the peace that we sleep with, all gifts from God. And if we don't acknowledge that, we run the risk of, developing a stony heart. Way back in the Old Testament, there's a preacher named Ezekiel, a prophet, and he used to talk about a stony heart. And he said, God speaking to his people, I will take from you your stony heart, and I will give you a heart of flesh. That's what Jesus is addressing to this man. It's the stoniness in your heart that's making you talk about you, me, but nobody else. So how do we recognize stoniness beginning to happen in our own hearts? Because it does. We recognize it when we realize that we don't give God credit for anything. We've done it all by ourselves. And now, as I said, Jesus probably was impressed with this man, but he also realized that this man thought really and truly he was it. He was the cat's meow. He knew exactly what was going on. Look at me, look at my success, and look at my problem. And Jesus realizes this man is getting a stony heart. He's not realizing that God is a part of my success. How else do we get one? Well, very often we get one when we start putting our treasures in the wrong place. We think to ourselves, well, if I store up enough money, if I store up enough good reputation, if I'm popular, successful enough, my life is going to be a bowl of cherries. I will eat, drink, and be merry. And that's when God steps in and said, Bud, you are such a fool. Who's going to get all of that when you go? The only thing you're going to own is maybe a 6-foot plot of ground, or maybe just an urn. But that's it. Who is going to benefit from all the goodness that you have had in your life? What Jesus is really saying is, where is your compassion? Where is your ability to look at someone, not judge them, not criticize them, just simply to look at them and say, he's my brother, she is my sister. If they need something, maybe I can help them. And if I can, I will. That's what Trinity is really all about. My experience of Trinity over the years has been a place where it says to anybody who comes into those doors, come, open. The doors are open. Welcome. Every door in this church says, welcome. All of you, I hear you saying it. Good morning. Welcome. That's what compassion is all about. That's what Jesus was trying to teach his disciples, and that's what this man was lacking. So today we have to ask ourselves, where is our compassion? Well, I can tell you that. Last week, if you had the privilege and you were awake enough to come to either the 8 or the 10 o'clock Mass, Derek Minnow Bloom, our social justice minister here in Trinity, knocked my socks off, talking about what Trinity does by way of compassion. How it says to anybody, welcome, come here. We'll make you safe. What? Come, we'll feed you. We'll counsel you. We'll be here for you. That's what Trinity is essentially all about. For me, it's a privilege to be here. It's a gift to be here. I said to Father Chase when he asked me, it's an honor to be here. Because to be among a people of compassion is to really be people who listen to what Jesus has to say. So I say to you, and occasionally I can even say it to myself, congratulations. The last thing we have to ever do before we go to sleep, and the first thing we should do before we get on with our day, is ask ourselves the question, am I going to live today, or have I lived today for myself or for God? Amen.